April 23, 1945. Camp Papago Park, Arizona. The wooden leg clicked against the concrete floor of the barracks. Click, drag, click, drag. A rhythm Klaus Richter had learned to hate. Each step was a metronome counting the beats of his humiliation. The prosthesis the Wehrmacht had given him in a field hospital outside Warsaw was little more than a carved tree branch with leather straps, the kind of medieval contraption that rubbed his stump raw every single day. By evening, the fabric of his trousers would be stained with fluid from the wounds that never quite healed. But that was fine. That was German. Efficiency. Sacrifice. Durchhalten. Endure. Klaus stood at attention in the April heat. 104 degrees, the American said, as if precision mattered when you were melting, waiting for roll call in a prison camp that made no sense. 3 months he'd been here. 3 months of contradictions that gnawed at everything he'd been taught to believe. The barbed wire was there. The guard towers were there. But the food? The food was obscene. White bread, real coffee, meat 3 times a week. He'd watched German civilians starve in the streets of Berlin before his deployment west. He'd seen mothers trade their wedding rings for moldy potatoes. And here in an enemy prison, he ate better than he had in 2 years of Wehrmacht service. It was a trick. It had to be. Some elaborate American deception fattening them up before what? He didn't know. That was the worst part, not knowing what the trap was. Richter. Klaus. Obergefreiter. He snapped his response, the syllables sharp despite the language barrier. The American sergeant, a boy really couldn't be more than 20, nodded without looking up from his clipboard. No sneer, no contempt, just bureaucratic indifference. Klaus had expected hatred. He'd been trained to expect it. Jews in New York pulling strings, mongrel races, the eternal enemy. But these Americans looked at him the way they might look at a broken tractor, a problem to be processed, filed, forgotten. That evening, after the roll call, after the men had shuffled back to their bunks to play cards with decks provided by the Red Cross, another absurdity, a private appeared at the barracks door. Richter? Klaus Richter? Klaus pushed himself to his feet, the leg protesting, the leather straps cutting into his thigh. Yes. Come with me. Hospital. The word hospital sent ice through his gut despite the heat. This was it. The camps in the East, the rumors they'd heard even through the censorship, the things they'd been told were enemy propaganda. Medical experiments, sterilization. Or worse, they'd decide he was useless. Lebensunwertes Leben, and he'd simply disappear into the desert. One less mouth to feed, one less problem. He followed anyway. What choice did he have? The camp hospital was a low, whitewashed building that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. Not blood, not gangrene, not the sweet rot smell of infected wounds left untreated. Klaus had been in a dozen field hospitals. He knew what medical facilities smelled like when systems collapsed. This wasn't that. Sit. An American captain, physician's insignia, medical corps, nameplate reading Miller, gestured to an examination table. He was older than most of the soldiers Klaus had seen, maybe 40, with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that moved with the careful economy of a man who'd stitched 1,000 wounds. Klaus sat, the paper crinkling beneath him. Captain Miller didn't speak. He simply knelt, rolled up Klaus's trouser leg, and began unwrapping the bandages around the prosthesis. The smell of suppuration filled the small room. Klaus felt his face burn, not from pain, but from shame. The shame of being reduced to this, of having his weakness exposed to the enemy, of being the limbless cripple who couldn't even keep a stump clean. Jesus Christ, Miller muttered. Not in anger, in something else. Dismay, maybe. He looked up at Klaus. How long have you been walking on this? Klaus didn't understand all the words, but the tone was clear. 6 monate, 6 months. 6 months. Miller stood, shaking his head. He called out, Lopez, get me the orthopedic forms. And tell Warner we've got another one. Another one? Klaus's German English was passable after 3 months of immersion, but he couldn't parse that. Another what? Miller returned his attention to Klaus, his expression shifting into something Klaus couldn't quite read. Pity? No. Pity would have been insulting but comprehensible. This was something else, something almost like professional offense. That thing, Miller said, pointing at the wooden leg propped against the wall, is substandard. It's causing infection. It's causing permanent damage to your residual limb, and it's completely unnecessary." He paused as if searching for simpler words. "We're going to fit you with a new prosthesis. American, properly made." Klaus stared at him. The words made sense individually, but strung together they formed a sentence so absurd he wondered if his English had failed him completely. "Ich verstehe nicht. I don't understand." "You will," Miller said. "Lopez will take you to the workshop tomorrow morning. Euro 900 hours." That night Klaus lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling beams while around him men snored and muttered in their sleep. Hans Becker in the bunk above him was grinding his teeth again, a nervous habit born from too many artillery barrages. Someone in the far corner whimpered, probably reliving France or the Eastern Front. These sounds were familiar. The barracks could have been any Wehrmacht posting. But the rest? Nothing about this place fit the architecture of the world he'd been taught. Klaus had been 21 when they'd taken his leg. The Battle of Stalingrad had already been lost by then, February 1943, though officially they weren't allowed to say lost. They said strategic withdrawal, tactical realignment, words that meant the same thing in any language: defeat, death, frozen corpses stacked like cordwood in the streets. Sue. He'd been part of the relief effort, the doomed attempt to break the siege. His unit had made it within 50 kilometers of the city before Soviet artillery had found them. Klaus remembered the sound, not the explosion itself, but the whistling beforehand, that ascending shriek that gave you just enough time to know you were about to die. He'd thrown himself into a shell crater, not fast enough. The medics had saved his life with a tourniquet and morphine. The field surgeons had taken his leg 4 inches below the knee, and the Reich, in its infinite wisdom, had carved him a wooden stump cap and told him he was still useful, still a soldier, still serving the Führer. He'd believed it, too. Or at least he'd believed he believed it. The ideology had been everywhere, as pervasive as air. His father had been an early party member, 1933, one of the March Violets who joined after Hitler's appointment as chancellor. His older brother Friedrich had been in the SS, stationed somewhere in Poland doing work they didn't discuss. Klaus had been 12 when they'd come to his school with charts showing skull measurements, cranial indices, the scientific proof of Aryan superiority. He'd been 14 when they'd shown the films, the beautiful blonde children, the wholesome families, and then degenerate art, degenerate people, the lame, the mad, the defective. Lebensunwertes Leben. Life unworthy of life. At 21, missing a leg, Klaus had wondered where exactly he fell on that spectrum now. But he'd endured. That was the German way. You endured, you sacrificed, you served. Even when the prosthesis rubbed his flesh raw, even when the phantom pains made him wake up screaming, even when he saw the looks from other soldiers, the whole ones, who saw him as a liability, a reminder of vulnerability. When they'd transferred him to the Western Front in early 1945, it had been a relief. The East was finished. Everyone knew it, even if saying so was treason. At least in France, there was the slim chance of survival. At least there, the Americans weren't the Soviets. He'd been captured outside Aachen in March. His unit had been holding a supply depot that existed only on outdated maps. The supplies had been gone for weeks. When the Americans came, Klaus and 14 others had surrendered without firing a shot. The American lieutenant who'd taken their weapons had looked almost bored. Then the journey. Trucks, trains, a ship across the Atlantic. Klaus had expected to be torpedoed. He'd expected to drown in the freezing water, one-legged and helpless. Instead, he'd arrived in New York Harbor, seen the Statue of Liberty, that cruel joke of a monument, and been shipped west to the desert. And now this, a new leg, American engineering, given freely to the enemy. It didn't fit. None of it fit. The next morning, Lopez, a cheerful private who spoke German with a thick accent, led Klaus across the compound to a building he'd never entered before. It was set apart from the main barracks, a converted warehouse with high windows that let in the brutal Arizona sun. Inside was a workshop that would have seemed fantastical even before the war. The smell hit him first. Machine oil, leather, rubber, and something chemical he couldn't identify. Then the sights. Workbenches lined with tools he recognized and tools he didn't. Shelves stocked with aluminum rods. Sheets of lightweight metal, springs, bolts, articulated joints that looked like something from a watchmaker's fever dream. In the center of the room, a man in civilian clothes, no uniform, just a button-down shirt and slacks, was bent over a lathe, shaping what appeared to be a foot, an artificial foot. Delicate, precise, beautiful, in the way that well-made things are beautiful. The man looked up as Lopez and Klaus entered. He was in his 50s, balding, with oil stains on his shirt and a smile that came easily. "This the German from Barrack 7?" he asked Lopez. "Yes, sir, Klaus Richter. Captain Miller sent him over." "Perfect, perfect." The man wiped his hands on a rag and extended one to Klaus. "Name's Frank Warner. I'm the prosthetist here." "You speak English?" Klaus took the hand reflexively, the grip firm and uncomplicated. "Some. Small. We'll make it work. Lopez, you can head out. I've got him from here." And just like that, Klaus was alone with the enemy. Warner gestured to a stool. "Sit. Let me see what you're working with." Klaus sat. Warner knelt, this kneeling again, this strange American habit of putting themselves physically lower, and began examining the German prosthesis with the same expression Captain Miller had worn. Professional offense. The look of a craftsman seeing shoddy work. "Who made this?" Warner asked. "Wehrmacht. Hospital. Poland. Poland. 1940? Yeah? Yes?" Warner made a noise in his throat. "They did you a disservice. This isn't even close to standard. No suspension, no articulation, no cushioning. You're basically walking on a peg leg. Medieval stuff." He looked up at Klaus. "Does it hurt?" Klaus almost laughed. Did it hurt? Every step was agony. Every morning he had to force himself out of bed, force himself to strap the hateful thing on, force himself to pretend he was still whole. "Yes," he said simply. "I'll bet." Warner stood, crossed to a filing cabinet, and pulled out a thick folder. "Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to take measurements, make a cast of your residual limb, and build you a proper prosthesis. It'll take about 2 weeks. When we're done, you'll have a leg that actually works. Aluminum shank, leather socket, articulated ankle. The same kind we're making for American veterans." There it was again. That impossible statement. The same kind we're making for American veterans. Klaus stared at him. "Why?" Warner paused, the folder halfway to his workbench. "Why what? Why, me." Klaus gestured at himself, at the uniform trousers with the Wehrmacht insignia still visible despite washing. "Enemy. Prisoner. Why?" Warner set the folder down. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he pulled up a stool of his own, sat and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "You want the official answer or the real one?" Klaus blinked. "Both. Official answer, Geneva Convention. Treatment of prisoners of war. Medical care, basic dignity, all that. We're signatories, so we're obligated." Warner paused. "Real answer? I'll give you the speech they gave me when I signed up for this program." He stood, crossed to a small desk in the corner, and retrieved a battered packet of papers. He flipped through them until he found what he was looking for. "This is from a memo issued by the War Department in 1944. I'm paraphrasing, but here's the gist. The United States government recognizes that the war will eventually end. When it does, we will need a stable, productive Europe capable of self-governance and economic recovery. Prisoners of war, particularly those who have suffered injuries, will return home. If they return as embittered, disabled men filled with resentment, they will become seeds of future conflict. If they return as functional individuals who have witnessed American industrial capacity and humanitarian principles firsthand, they become ambassadors for peace." Warner looked up from the paper. "They're calling it strategic humanity. Rebuild the enemy before you send them home. Give them a reason not to hate us. Or at least, give them a reason to think twice." Klaus felt something crack inside his chest. Not break, crack like ice under pressure. "Propaganda," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," Warner agreed. "Probably. I don't know. I'm just a technician. I make legs, but I'll tell you what I do know. Every man who walks out of this workshop with a functioning prosthesis is one less man who'll spend the rest of his life bitter and broken. Whether that's propaganda or humanitarianism, I honestly don't care. The work's the same." He returned to Klaus, measuring tape in hand. "Now, let's get started." The measurements took an hour. Warner worked with the focused intensity of a man who'd done this 1,000 times, but still cared about doing it right. He measured the circumference of Klaus's thigh at 6 different points. He measured the length from the residual limb to the floor. He had Klaus stand, sit, walk, shift his weight. He took notes in a cramped, rapid handwriting that covered 3 pages. "You've got good muscle mass," Warner observed. "That'll help with control. But you're compensating heavily on your left side. You're going to need physical therapy once the new prosthesis is fitted. Otherwise, you'll wreck your hip." Physical therapy. Another impossibility. Klaus had seen what happened to wounded German soldiers. If you could walk, you walked. If you couldn't, you were assigned to clerical work or, increasingly, sent home to your family to become their burden. The idea of dedicated rehabilitation, of time and resources spent on making a cripple functional again, it was absurd. And yet here he was. Warner made a plaster cast of his stump, a cold, unpleasant process that left Klaus feeling vulnerable and exposed. While the plaster dried, Warner talked. Not interrogation, not propaganda, just talk. About his work, about the engineering challenges of prosthetics, about the different materials they were experimenting with. Before the war, prosthetics were mostly wood and leather, Warner said, cleaning plaster off his tools. Heavy, uncomfortable, barely functional. But the war's pushed innovation like nothing else. We're using aircraft-grade aluminum now. Lightweight but strong. And we're figuring out better suspension systems, better joints. In 5 years, 10 years? I think we'll have prosthetics that are so good you'll barely know you're wearing one. Klaus didn't respond. He was thinking about the wooden leg propped against the wall, the medieval relic that the Wehrmacht had strapped to him and called sufficient. "How many?" he asked. "How many prisoners? You do this?" Warner paused, considering. "In this camp?" "Maybe 40 so far, across all the POW camps in the States. I don't know. Thousands, probably. We've got workshops like this at a dozen facilities. Thousands. Thousands of enemy soldiers being given cutting-edge medical care. The numbers didn't make sense. The economics didn't make sense. Germany was starving. Germany's factories were rubble. Germany couldn't spare the resources for its own wounded, let alone enemy wounded. But America could. America, with its incomprehensible wealth, its industrial capacity that seemed to have no ceiling, its bizarre philosophy that said even your enemy deserved to walk properly. "Your country," Klaus said slowly, "is very strange." Warner laughed, a genuine sound, unforced. "You're not the first person to say that. Hell, I think we're strange, and I was born here." That night, Klaus lay in his bunk again, but this time he didn't sleep. He thought about the workshop. He thought about Warner's hands stained with oil and plaster. He thought about the memo from the War Department. Strategic humanity. He thought about the lessons he'd learned, about strength and weakness, about the hierarchies of human worth, about the necessity of ruthlessness, about how compassion was a luxury for the victorious, how sentiment weakened the state, how certain lives, the disabled, the defective, the unproductive, were burdens to be eliminated, not accommodated. He thought about his brother, Friedrich, in the SS, about the things that weren't discussed, about the cattle cars he'd seen at rail junctions in Poland, packed with people being shipped east, about how he'd been told those people were enemies, subhumans, threats to the Reich that had to be neutralized. He thought about Captain Miller's face when he'd seen the infected stump. Not disgust, not contempt, just concern for a patient. He thought about Warner measuring his leg with the same care he'd give an American soldier. And he thought, what if everything I've been taught is a lie? Not all of it, perhaps. Not immediately. Belief systems don't collapse instantly. They crack, they fracture, they give way piece by piece. But the first crack had appeared, and Klaus could feel it spreading. 14 days later, Warner called Klaus back to the workshop. The prosthesis was ready. It sat on the workbench like a sculpture, like something that belonged in a museum of modern art, rather than strapped to a cripple's stump. The socket was leather, deep brown and meticulously stitched. The shank was aluminum, buffed to a dull shine that didn't catch the light too garishly. The ankle joint was articulated, 3 separate components that moved smoothly, quietly, like a real joint. The foot was shaped, contoured with a slight arch and rubber treads on the sole. It was beautiful. "Go ahead," Warner said. "Try it on." Klaus approached the bench slowly. Up close, he could see the details, the tiny screws holding the joints together, the reinforced stitching on the socket, the foam padding inside that would cushion his stump. He could see the care that had gone into every element. Sit, Warner instructed. Let me help you with the first fitting. Klaus sat. Warner knelt, again that kneeling, and removed Klaus's crude German prosthesis. Then, with the gentle precision of a man handling something fragile, he slid the new socket over Klaus's stump. It fit. Not perfectly. Nothing fits perfectly on the first try, but close. Very close. Warner adjusted the straps, tightened the suspension, checked the alignment. Then he stood back. Okay. Stand up. Klaus stood. The difference was immediate. The weight distribution was even. The socket didn't dig into his flesh. The aluminum shank was lighter than wood, but felt more stable. He took a step. No click. No drag. Just a step. Almost normal. He took another. The ankle joint flexed, absorbed the impact, sprang back. He could feel the feedback through his leg, his hip, his spine. His body remembered this. His muscles remembered how to walk. He crossed the workshop. 6 steps. 8. 10. He turned, came back. 15 steps without pain. 15 steps without grinding agony. He stopped in front of Warner, breathing hard, not from exertion, but from the shock of it. How does it feel? Warner asked, and his face was open, genuinely curious. Klaus couldn't speak. If he spoke, something inside him would break completely, and he wasn't ready for that. Warner seemed to understand. He nodded. We'll need to make some adjustments. The socket needs to be taken in about ½ an inch on the lateral side. And I want you to come back in 3 days so I can check for pressure points. But the hard part's done. You've got a functional leg now. Klaus found his voice. It came out rough. Thank you. Warner waved a hand. Don't thank me. Thank American taxpayers. They're the ones footing the bill. He paused, then grinned at his own unintentional pun. Footing the bill. Get it? Despite himself, Klaus smiled. It felt strange on his face, that expression. He couldn't remember the last time he'd smiled. Over the next 3 days, Klaus walked. He walked the perimeter of the compound, ignoring the stares of other prisoners. He walked during exercise periods, during free time, during the long Arizona twilights when the heat finally broke. He walked until his stump was sore, not from pain, but from use, from muscles rediscovering their purpose. Other prisoners noticed. Becker, his bunkmate, asked questions. Klaus tried to explain and gave up halfway through. The words felt inadequate. How do you explain that the enemy had given you back something you'd thought was lost forever? How do you explain that compassion from your captors felt more devastating than cruelty? They're trying to break us, Becker said, nodding sagely. Make us soft. Make us forget who we are. Klaus didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. On the 3rd day, he returned to Warner's workshop for the follow-up. Warner made minor adjustments. Shaved down a section of the socket, added a thin pad to redistribute pressure. Then he had Klaus walk again, watching critically. Better, Warner pronounced. Much better. You're already correcting your gait. Give it another month and you'll be walking like you never lost the leg. I will not forget, Klaus said quietly. Forget what? Klaus gestured at the prosthesis, at the workshop, at everything. This, what you do. Why? Warner's expression shifted, became more serious. Good. That's the point, actually. We want you to remember. We want you to go home, whenever this damn war finally ends, and tell people what you saw. Tell them about the camps, about the food, about the leg. Tell them the Americans aren't monsters. Propaganda, Klaus said again. But this time he was smiling slightly. Sure, Warner agreed. Best kind, though. The kind that's true. May 8th. 1945. The news came over the loudspeakers in the camp. Germany had surrendered. Unconditional. Total. The war in Europe was over. Klaus stood in the yard with 300 other prisoners and felt nothing. No grief. No relief. Just a vast, empty numbness. The Reich was gone. The Führer was dead. Everything they'd fought for, bled for, sacrificed for, ended. Finished. Around him, men wept. Some in sorrow, some in relief. Some simply stood, staring at nothing, processing the incomprehensible. That night in the barracks, someone started singing Die Wacht am Rhein, the old patriotic song, defiant and mournful. One by one, other voices joined. Klaus listened, but didn't sing. He couldn't. The words felt hollow in his mouth. In the bunk above him, Becker was crying, harsh, ugly sobs that shook the frame. What was it for? He kept asking. What was it all for? Klaus didn't answer. He didn't know. What he did know was this. In the coming weeks, as the stories filtered in, the camps in Poland, the gas chambers, the industrialized murder of millions, he would have to reckon with what he'd believed, what he'd served, what his country had become. He would have to acknowledge that the prosthesis on his leg wasn't just a medical device. It was a statement. It was a philosophy made tangible. It said, "You are human. Even as our enemy, even as a cripple, even as a prisoner, you are human and you deserve to be treated as such." It said, "We can afford compassion. We choose compassion because we believe it makes us stronger, not weaker." It said, "Go home. Rebuild. Remember this. Choose differently." In the years after the war, Klaus would return to Germany. He would walk through the rubble of Berlin on his American leg. He would find work, marry, have children. He would tell his story to anyone who would listen, not as propaganda, but as testimony. He would say again and again, "They gave me back my leg. The enemy gave me back my leg." Some would understand, some wouldn't. But the leg would remain a constant presence, a reminder of the day his world cracked open and forced him to see that strength and cruelty were not synonyms, that power could be deployed in service of mercy, that even in war, there was space for humanity. The Americans had given him a weapon, not a rifle, not a grenade, a leg, a weapon that dismantled hate through its mere existence, a weapon that said, "We are not what you thought we were." And maybe, just maybe, you are not what you were taught to be. The program Klaus had stumbled into was no accident. It was policy, deliberate, and systematic. In 1943, as Allied victory began to seem inevitable, strategic planners in Washington started thinking about the post-war world. They'd learned from the Treaty of Versailles, learned that humiliation breeds resentment, that economic devastation creates instability, that treating enemies as irredeemable guarantees future conflict. So they planned differently. The POW program was part of it. By 1945, there were over 425,000 German prisoners of war held in camps across the United States. They were treated by and large according to Geneva Convention standards, and often better. They worked on farms, earned wages, attended camp theaters and orchestras. They ate better than many American civilians, which caused no small amount of resentment stateside. The prosthetics program was smaller, more specialized, but no less deliberate. Wounded prisoners were identified, assessed, and fitted with artificial limbs, manufactured to the same standards as those provided to American veterans. The rationale was partly humanitarian, partly pragmatic. Returning disabled prisoners to a devastated Germany would create a burden. Returning functional men with first-hand experience of American capacity would create something else. Witnesses. Warner had been right about the memo. The actual document, declassified decades later, reads in part, "Prisoners of war who receive advanced medical care, particularly in the field of rehabilitative services, represent a low-cost investment in post-war stability. Their testimony regarding American treatment will carry significant weight in occupied territories. Furthermore, functional amputees are more likely to contribute to economic recovery, reducing the burden on Allied reconstruction efforts." It was cold calculus dressed up as compassion. Or perhaps it was compassion that happened to align with strategic interest. The distinction mattered philosophically, but not practically. What mattered was the result. Men like Klaus, returning to Germany with American-made prosthetics, became walking contradictions to Nazi propaganda. They'd been told Americans were barbaric, materialistic, spiritually inferior. Instead, they'd encountered industrial efficiency, married to humanitarian principle. They'd seen the proof that democracy wasn't weakness, that pluralism wasn't chaos, that a society could be strong without being cruel. It didn't convert everyone. Some prisoners returned home still convinced of Aryan superiority, still bitter about defeat, still clinging to the ideology that had shaped their youth. But enough were changed, enough questioned, enough doubted, enough looked at their American prosthesis and wondered that the seeds of a different Germany were planted. June 1946. Klaus stood on the deck of a Liberty ship, watching the coast of France appear on the horizon. He was going home. Finally, after 15 months in captivity, he was going home. Around him, other prisoners lined the rail, hundreds of men in faded Wehrmacht uniforms, clutching duffel bags containing everything they owned. Most were silent. What was there to say? They were returning to a country that no longer existed, to cities that were rubble, to an uncertain future and a divided occupation. Klaus's right leg, his American leg, stood steady against the roll of the ship. He'd walked 5,000 miles on this leg. He'd worked on farms in Arizona picking cotton and vegetables alongside Mexican laborers. He'd attended camp classes taught by American volunteers, learning basic English, basic mathematics, basic principles of constitutional government. He'd watched films about democracy, read newspapers describing the Marshall Plan, listened to lectures about the Reconstruction ahead. Indoctrination, some of the prisoners called it. Re-education. Klaus didn't disagree, but he also didn't mind. Because the alternative, clinging to the belief system that had led Germany to ruin, seemed worse. The ship docked in Le Havre. The prisoners were processed, documented, assigned to trains that would carry them east through occupied France into the British and American zones of Germany. Klaus's destination was Hamburg, or what remained of it. He had a sister there, married to a dock worker. He hoped she'd survive the bombing. The train journey took 2 days. Through the windows, Klaus watched Europe pass by, fields still scarred with trenches, towns with half their buildings missing, refugees camped along the roads with their possessions in handcarts. The war was over, but its consequences stretched to every horizon. At the border, British military police boarded the train to inspect documents. A young MP, couldn't have been more than 19, stopped at Klaus's seat. "That leg," the MP said, pointing. "American make?" Klaus nodded. "Thought so. My uncle's got one just like it. Lost his below the knee in North Africa." The MP smiled, a quick, sympathetic expression. "Good kit, that. You're lucky." Lucky. Klaus turned the word over in his mind. Lucky to have lost his leg? Lucky to have been captured? Lucky to have encountered the one enemy in history that built its defeated opponents better prosthetics instead of just digging larger graves. Maybe lucky was the right word after all. Hamburg was worse than he'd imagined. 70% of the city was destroyed. Where the Ulster had once reflected grand buildings, now it reflected sky through the gaps where buildings had been. The streets were canyons of rubble. People moved through them like ghosts, hollow-eyed and gaunt. Klaus found his sister living in the basement of what had once been an apartment building. The upper floors were gone, collapsed in the firestorm of 1943. Gerda recognized him immediately, despite the years, despite the leg, despite everything. She wept. He held her. Neither spoke about the war. Over the following weeks, Klaus tried to rebuild. He registered with the Allied authorities, received ration cards, found work clearing rubble for the reconstruction crews. The American prosthesis drew stares, questions, occasional hostility. American goods, American charity. Some saw it as humiliation, as proof of defeat's totality. Klaus didn't argue. He just worked. At night, in the basement with Gerda and her 2 children, he told stories about Arizona. About the desert, about Warner's workshop, about the incomprehensible abundance of the POW camps. The children listened with wide eyes, as if he were describing another planet. "They gave you a new leg?" Gerda's eldest, a girl of 7, asked. "For free?" "For free," Klaus confirmed. Why? He'd been asked that question dozens of times now. He still didn't have a complete answer, but he tried. Because they could, and because they believed it would make a difference. Did it? Klaus looked down at his leg, the aluminum shank, the articulated ankle, the engineering marvel that let him walk, work, live. He thought about Warner's hands, about Captain Miller's concern, about the memo that called it strategic humanity. "Yes," he said, "I think it did." 15 years later, Klaus stood in a gymnasium in Hamburg watching his daughter graduate from university. She was the first in the family to attend, to earn a degree, to have access to opportunities that seemed fantastical just a generation earlier. She wanted to be a teacher. She wanted to help build the new Germany, the democratic Germany, the Federal Republic. Klaus applauded with the other parents, and his American leg held steady. The Germany of 1961 was almost unrecognizable compared to 1946. The Marshall Plan had done its work. The currency reform had done its work. Democracy, imposed by occupiers and then grudgingly, gradually embraced by the occupied, had taken root. There was still poverty, still resentment, still the divided nation and the wall that had just gone up in Berlin. But there was also prosperity, stability, hope, And there were hundreds of thousands of men like Klaus. Men who'd been prisoners, who'd seen American capacity firsthand, who'd been treated not as subhumans, but as humans who'd simply been on the wrong side. Not all of them had changed. Not all of them had abandoned the old beliefs. But enough had questioned, enough had doubted, enough had carried home some small seed of a different way of thinking. Klaus's prosthesis was 20 years old now. The leather was worn, the aluminum scratched and dented. Warner had told him it would last 10 years, maybe 15 with proper care. Klaus had made it last 20 through sheer stubbornness and regular maintenance. He oiled the joints, replaced the straps, kept the socket clean. It was part of him now. More than part of him. It was a touchstone, a physical reminder of the day his certainties had cracked. His daughter approached after the ceremony, diploma in hand, beaming. "Papa, did you see?" "I saw," Klaus said, pulling her into an embrace. "I'm proud of you. I couldn't have done it without you working so hard, paying for the books, the fees. That's what fathers do," Klaus interrupted gently. But he thought, I couldn't have worked without the leg. I couldn't have provided without being able to walk. I couldn't have given you this opportunity without what an enemy gave me first. That night, alone in his small apartment, Klaus wrote a letter. He'd written this letter dozens of times in his mind over the years, but never committed it to paper. Now, with his daughter graduated and his own mortality starting to feel less abstract, he was 43, but the war had aged him. He felt the urgency to get the words down. "Dear Mr. Warner, I do not know if you will remember me. I was Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, prisoner of war at Camp Papago Park, Arizona, April through June 1945. You fitted me with a prosthetic leg, aluminum shank, articulated ankle, leather socket. It has been 20 years, almost to the day. I am writing to tell you that the leg still functions. I have walked perhaps 50,000 miles on it. I have worked construction, cleared rubble, helped rebuild Hamburg. I have climbed stairs, danced at my wedding, carried my children. The leg has made all of this possible. But more than this, I am writing to tell you that you were right. That memo you showed me, strategic humanity, it worked. Perhaps not in the way the War Department intended, perhaps not as propaganda or policy, but it worked on me. I returned to Germany expecting to hate America. I had been taught to hate. Instead, I carried home your leg, and with it, a question that has never quite left me. What kind of nation gives its enemy such a gift? I have spent 20 years trying to answer that question. I have watched the Marshall Plan rebuild my country. I have voted in free elections. I have seen my daughter attend university. And I have concluded this: you were engaged in a different kind of war. Not with bullets, but with mercy. Not by destroying the enemy, but by refusing to let us remain enemies. My daughter asked me once why you gave me the leg. I told her, because you believed it would make a difference. She asked if it did. I said yes. But the fuller answer is this: it made all the difference. Not just to my leg, but to my mind. To my understanding of what strength means, what power means, what a civilization is capable of when it chooses compassion over cruelty. I do not know if you are still alive. I do not know if this letter will reach you. But I needed to write it, needed to say, thank you. Thank you for the leg. Thank you for the lesson. Thank you for the weapon of peace that dismantled my hatred more effectively than any bomb. If there is a heaven, and if by some miracle I arrive there before you, I will save you a seat. I owe you that much at least. With deepest respect, Klaus Richter, Hamburg, Federal Republic of Germany. He addressed the envelope to Frank Warner, care of Camp Papago Park, Arizona, USA. He knew the camp was probably closed, the workshop dismantled, the whole operation dissolved into history. But he mailed the letter anyway. 3 months later, a response arrived. The handwriting was shakier, the paper cheaper, but the voice was unmistakable. Dear Klaus, I remember you. Of course I remember you. You were the one who asked why. Most prisoners didn't ask. They accepted the prosthesis, grateful or suspicious, and moved on. But you asked. I am glad the leg has served you well. I am gladder still to hear about your daughter, your work, your life. That was always the point, not the device itself, but the life it enabled. You asked what kind of nation gives its enemy such a gift. I have thought about that question many times over the years. I think the answer is a nation that is either very wise or very foolish. Perhaps both at once. I believed that showing mercy to the defeated would make them less likely to seek revenge. that investing in rehabilitation would be cheaper than suppressing rebellion, that treating prisoners as human beings would make them think twice before dehumanizing others. Was I right? I don't know. The world is complicated. But your letter suggests that maybe in at least one case, the gamble paid off. I am 74 now. I closed the workshop in 1946 and returned to civilian life. I have made prosthetics for veterans, for industrial accident survivors, for children born with limb differences. I have fitted thousands of legs, but I still remember yours. I remember the look on your face when you took those first steps. I remember thinking, this is what victory looks like. Not parades or medals, but a man walking without pain. You do not owe me anything. But if you insist on saving me a seat in heaven, make sure it has a good workbench. I will want to keep busy. Take care of that leg, and take care of yourself. Your friend, Frank Warner Klaus, folded the letter carefully and placed it in a metal box where he kept his important documents, discharge papers, marriage certificate, his daughter's birth certificate. And now this, proof that the connection had been real, that the humanity had been genuine, that the weapon of peace had hit its target and changed trajectory of a life. The story of Klaus Richter and his American prosthesis might have ended there, a footnote in the history of POW treatment, a small human drama in the vast machinery of post-war reconstruction. But stories have a way of rippling outward, of touching lives in unexpected ways. In 1967, Klaus received a phone call from a journalist at Der Spiegel. The magazine was running a series on German-American relations, on the post-war reconstruction, on the networks of connection that had been built between former enemies. Someone had mentioned the POW prosthetics program. The journalist wanted to interview Klaus. He almost refused. He was 53 now, settled in his routines, uninterested in publicity. But his daughter, now a teacher herself, married with a child of her own, convinced him. "Papa," she said, "people need to hear this story. Especially now." Now, 1967. The world was convulsing again. Vietnam, student protests, a generation questioning everything their parents had built. In Germany, young people were asking hard questions about the Nazi past, about complicity, about how a civilized nation had descended into barbarism. The easy answers, that it was Hitler's fault, that ordinary Germans hadn't known, that the past should stay buried, were no longer satisfying. Klaus agreed to the interview. The journalist was young, maybe 30, with long hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He set up a tape recorder in Klaus's living room and asked him to tell the story from the beginning. Klaus did. Stalingrad? The wooden leg. The capture? Arizona. Warner? The aluminum prosthesis. The question that had haunted him for 22 years. Why? "And what's your answer?" the journalist asked. "Why did they do it?" Klaus considered. "I used to think it was propaganda. Then I thought it was strategy. Now, I think it was something more complicated. I think they were trying to prove something, to themselves, not just to us. They were trying to prove that you could win a war without becoming what you fought against, that you could have power without cruelty, that strength and mercy weren't opposites. Did they succeed? Ask yourself," Klaus said quietly. "Look at Germany now. We are prosperous. We are democratic. We are allied with our former enemies. Would that have been possible if the Americans had treated us the way we treated others? If they'd built death camps for German prisoners? If they'd starved us, worked us to death, thrown our disabled into mass graves?" The journalist didn't answer. He didn't need to. The article appeared in Der Spiegel 3 weeks later. 4 pages, with photographs, Klaus in his workshop, Klaus walking, a close-up of the prosthesis with its worn leather and scratched aluminum. The headline read, "Das amerikanische Bein, wie die USA den Frieden mit Menschlichkeit gewannen. The American League, how the USA won peace through humanity." The response was immediate and divided. Some readers were moved. They wrote letters thanking Klaus for sharing his story, for providing a different perspective on the post-war period. Others were angry. They accused him of being a collaborator, of whitewashing American imperialism, of ignoring Vietnam and American hypocrisy. Klaus read the letters but didn't respond. He understood the anger. He understood the skepticism. The America that had given him a leg in 1945 was the same America napalming villages in Southeast Asia in 1967. The contradiction was real. The hypocrisy was real. But so was the leg. Both things could be true at once. That was the terrible complexity of it. Nations, like people, contained multitudes. They could be generous and cruel, wise and foolish, compassionate and brutal, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes sequentially, always imperfectly. The lesson of the prosthesis wasn't that America was perfect. It was that even flawed actors could choose mercy, and that mercy could have consequences beyond calculation. October 1989. Klaus was 71 years old. The prosthesis was 44. Both were showing their age, but both still functioned. He stood in a crowd of thousands at the Berlin Wall, watching with disbelief as young people climbed onto the concrete barrier, as border guards who'd been ordered to shoot merely weeks ago now stood aside, as the barrier that had divided Germany for 28 years began to crack, splinter, crumble. His daughter stood beside him, tears streaming down her face. His grandchildren, 3 of them now, ages 12, 9, and 6, stared in wonder at history unfolding in real time. "Papa," his eldest grandchild asked, "is it really over?" Klaus didn't know how to answer. Was what over? The division? The Cold War? The long shadow of 1945? He settled for, something is ending, something else is beginning. Around him, people were singing, crying, embracing strangers. Someone had brought champagne and was pouring it over the wall. Someone else was attacking the concrete with a hammer, chipping off fragments as souvenirs. East Berliners were crossing into the West for the first time in decades, eyes wide with shock at the shop windows, the abundance, the freedom. Klaus thought about cycles, about how Germany had fallen into darkness and been pulled back toward light, about how the seeds planted in 1945, democracy, reconstruction, reconciliation, had taken 44 years to fully blossom, but here they were, blooming. He thought about Warner, dead now for 5 years. He'd received the news from Warner's daughter, who'd found Klaus's address in her father's papers and written to let him know. The funeral had been small, family only, but she'd thought Klaus would want to know. She'd enclosed a photograph. Warner in his workshop, much older but still wearing that same oil-stained shirt, still grinning at the camera. Klaus had that photograph framed. It hung in his living room, next to a photograph of his own family. Now, watching the wall fall, he felt Warner's presence like a whisper. This is what we were building toward. Not this exact moment, we couldn't have predicted this, but this possibility. The chance that enemies could become friends, that division could be healed, that mercy could compound over decades into something transformative. Someone handed Klaus a hammer. "Here," they said, "take a piece of history." Klaus took the hammer. He approached the wall, that massive, ugly scar across his city, his country, his life, and swung. The impact jarred his arms, his shoulders, his prosthetic leg. But the leg held. Of course it held. It had held for 44 years. It would hold for this. He chipped off a fragment of concrete, rough and gray and ugly, and handed the hammer to the next person. He gave the fragment to his youngest grandchild. "Remember this," Klaus said. "Remember that walls can fall. Remember that enemies can reconcile. Remember that small acts of mercy can have consequences far beyond what anyone imagines." The child looked at the concrete, not understanding. But someday Klaus hoped she would. Klaus Richter died in 1994, at the age of 76. The prosthesis outlasted him. At his funeral, attended by family, friends, former colleagues, and a surprising number of people who'd read about him in that 1967 article, his daughter gave the eulogy. She talked about his work ethic, his quiet strength, his dedication to family. And she talked about the leg. "My father carried that American prosthesis for 49 years, she said. It was more than a medical device to him. It was a reminder, a teacher, a philosophical argument made of aluminum and leather. He used to say that the Americans had given him a weapon. Not a gun, but something more dangerous to the ideology he'd been raised in. Proof that the enemy could be humane. Proof that strength didn't require cruelty. Proof that investment in former enemies wasn't weakness, but the deepest form of strategy. He brought that lesson home from Arizona, and he lived it. He rebuilt his life. He helped rebuild his city. He raised his children, raised me, to understand that yesterday's enemies can become tomorrow's friends if we choose mercy over vengeance. In a small way, my father's life was shaped by American policy. But in a larger way, American policy was proved correct by lives like his. The gamble paid off. The strategic humanity worked. Not perfectly, Not universally, but enough. Just enough. She paused, looking out at the assembled mourners. The prosthesis is now in a museum. The Berlin Allied Museum agreed to take it as part of their collection on post-war reconstruction. It sits in a glass case, labeled and explained, a small artifact of a massive transformation. But the lesson it taught, the lesson my father lived, that doesn't belong in a museum. That belongs to us. To every generation that must choose how to treat the defeated, the wounded, the enemy. Do we destroy them completely? Do we leave them broken and bitter? Or do we do the harder thing, the more expensive thing, the thing that seems foolish until decades later when you realize it was wise? Do we give them the tools to rebuild, the dignity to recover, the chance to become partners instead of perpetual adversaries? My father knew the answer. He carried it with him every single day, in every single step. The American leg was a weapon of peace, and it won. The prosthesis sits in the Berlin Allied Museum today, exactly where Klaus's daughter said it would be. Visitors stop to read the placard, to look at the worn leather and scratched aluminum, to marvel at the craftsmanship of 1945 technology. Some see it as a curiosity, others as propaganda, still others as evidence of American soft power, the Marshall Plan in miniature, the seductive force of generous capitalism. But some, those who pause longer, who read the full story, who think about the man who wore it and the man who made it, see something else. They see a question. The question Klaus carried for 49 years. The question that cracked open his worldview and forced him to rebuild it from scratch. The question that every generation must answer anew. What kind of society do we want to be? Do we want to be the kind that sees enemies as permanently other, as subhuman, as worthy only of destruction? Or do we want to be the kind that sees even our enemies as human beings, who, given the chance, given the tools, given the mercy, might choose a different path? Do we want to be the kind of power that rules through fear and violence? Or the kind that leads through example, through investment, through the calculated risk that compassion might be repaid with cooperation? These aren't easy questions. They weren't easy in 1945. They're not easy now. The world remains complicated, full of genuine threats, genuine evil, genuine malevolence that cannot be reasoned with or mercied away. But Klaus Richter's American leg suggests that sometimes, not always, not universally, but sometimes, the harder path is also the wiser one. That the expensive choice, the risky choice, the choice to give your enemy a leg to stand on instead of leaving them crippled and bitter, can pay dividends that pure military victory never could. It's a lesson that feels especially urgent in an age of perpetual conflict, of terrorism and counterterrorism, of cycles of revenge that stretch across generations. What if, the prosthesis asks, we broke the cycle? Not through more violence, not through more walls, not through more dehumanization, but through the strategic deployment of humanity. It's a weapon, after all. Warner said so himself. Not a weapon of destruction, but a weapon of transformation. A weapon that wages war on hatred by making it harder to maintain. A weapon that attacks extremism by demonstrating alternatives. A weapon that defeats the narrative of eternal enmity by creating evidence that enemies can become something else. Klaus Richter walked 50,000 miles on that weapon. He rebuilt his life with it. He passed its lesson to his children, his grandchildren, his country. And now it sits in a museum asking its question to anyone willing to listen. What kind of weapon will you choose? The story of Klaus Richter is a fictionalized composite, but the prosthetics program for German POWs was real. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States maintained over 500 POW camps across the country, holding approximately 425,000 German prisoners and smaller numbers of Italian and Japanese prisoners. Treatment generally exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. The prosthetics program, while less well documented than other aspects of POW treatment, did exist. Wounded prisoners were provided with artificial limbs, orthopedic care, and physical therapy. The rationale combined humanitarian concerns with strategic calculation. Functional ex-soldiers would be better equipped to participate in post-war reconstruction and less likely to harbor destabilizing resentment. Whether this program constituted propaganda, humanitarianism, or strategic wisdom remains debatable. What's not debatable is that it represented a choice about how to treat defeated enemies, about what kind of power to be, about how to wage peace as deliberately as nations wage war. That choice and its consequences echo still.